Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 40 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus chapter 26, beginning in verse 14, and exploring all the way to Leviticus chapter 27, ending in verse 34, which is the end of the chapter. We're also taking a look at Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 41. We've got quite a bit to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. So our story picks up today in Leviticus chapter 26. Yesterday we talked about how this chapter essentially gives the Israelites two different paths, a path in which they obey God or a path in which they disobey God. So if they obey God, they will be blessed and prosperous. If they disobey God, then it's going to lead to a life of despair, a life of slavery, debilitating diseases, fevers, blindness, so on and so forth. So what is important to note about this today is it elaborates a bit more on the punishments for disobedience. Like I said, there are horrible diseases, fear would reign in the community, and the enemies of Israel would steal food from the mouths of the people. The chapter essentially goes on to talk about the consequences of not following God. And essentially, there is still hope if the people fall into this world of sin. God says if they repent of their sins and the sins of their fathers, then he will offer them forgiveness. So it's this idea of even when they screw up, they can make things right by repenting and turning back to God. But ultimately, they would still have consequences for their disobedience. The Lord promised that he would not break the covenant that he had made with Jacob, Abraham, and Isaac, and the Lord would not forget the people of Israel whom he delivered out of Egypt. So the Israelites, no matter what they do, are still going to be God's people. There are going to be consequences for their actions, but he's not going to abandon them because they are his chosen people. Moving forward to Leviticus chapter 27. In this particular chapter, the Lord tells Moses and Aaron that if a man promised a servant of God, he must keep that promise and not change it. And God essentially says that these types of vows could be redeemed if they could not be fulfilled. So essentially this whole chapter is talking about redemption for unfilled vows, rules about offering up animals, and other types of gifts in terms of property. So God gives specific instructions on the amount of silver that was supposed to be given to free a servant that was promised to God. So males were worth more than females, and essentially a male between the age of 20 and 60 was worth 50 shekels of silver, and a female was only worth 30. And people were worth less if they were younger than 20 and older than 60. And this is essentially because of their value in terms of the labor that they can do. Within this chapter, there's also rules about offering up animals. So an animal offered to God could not be changed or altered. He said if an animal had to be exchanged for another, it had to be of equal worth. Also, a beast that was considered unclean could not be offered at all as an offering. Instead, it could be brought before a priest who would evaluate it, and a 20% penalty was added if the person who offered the animal wanted to buy it back. So essentially, if someone brings an unworthy offering before the Lord, the priest is going to evaluate it and be like, yo, you didn't bring something acceptable, so you have to bring this again plus 20%. Now, you could also offer a house as a gift. The priest would evaluate the house and decide a fair price. If a person wanted to buy the house back, they would have to pay an extra 20%. And so you keep seeing this. If someone wants to buy something back, it adds 20%. Also, a person could gift a field if it belonged to his family. The value of the field would depend on what kind of seed and amount that it grew. And then a portion of that land would revert back to the giver or the giver's heirs during the year of Jubilee. And then there's also some other gifts that are mentioned that cannot be offered to God because they already belong to him, and they include animals, tithes, and a tenth of all crops. Moving forward to Numbers chapter 1. In Numbers chapters 1, it discusses the topics that includes God's commands to Moses, his choosing of helpers, the census of Israel's soldiers, and essentially special assignments for the tribe of Levi. So at the beginning of this chapter, the Lord appears to Moses inside the tent of meeting, and essentially he tells Moses to do a census of the children of Israel. And this was essentially to discuss the capacity for war. And so Moses was only to count the able-bodied males. They had to be at least 20 years of age, and they would be identified by their families, and then God would essentially evaluate the overall strength of Israel based upon each and every individual family. And then essentially this would be a military census to identify who would be available to participate in the battle, ultimately for the promised land, the land that God had promised to them. And so even though God is infinite in power, he still required his people to fight for their right to occupy this region. So God wanted to use the people to drive out the people of the land. Now, Numbers chapter 1 does give specific instructions regarding the census. There were 12 tribes, and each of these tribes were based on the original sons of Jacob. And then each tribe had a leader who would be named, the head of the household. And then these men would stand by Moses' side and lead the troops. And then these men would determine the number of men in their tribe that would report to Moses. And then Moses would relay this information about the size of the forces to God. And he would do this individually and by name rather than just giving total numbers. So it was very, very specific. So it is here with this that we are going to end our reading for tonight. All right, folks. So I do hope that you will join me for tomorrow for day 41 as we take a look at Numbers chapter 1 beginning in verse 42 and going all the way to Numbers chapter 3 ending in verse 32. As always, folks, God bless.